Hello and welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I'm of course your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 250th episode, our returning guest is Ray E. Boomhower. You first heard Ray E. Boomhower on episode 213 of the podcast. Ray E. Boomhower is senior editor of the Indiana Historical Society Press. He is the editor of the IHS's quarterly popular history magazine, Traces of Indiana and Midwestern History. Boomhower has been with the Society since 1987. A native of Mishawaka, Indiana, Boomhower graduated from Indiana University in 1982 with degrees in journalism and political science. He received his master's degree in U.S. history from Indiana University, Indianapolis in 1995. Before joining the Society staff, he worked in public relations for the Indiana State Museum and as a reporter for 2 Indiana daily newspapers. Along with numerous articles for Traces, the Indiana Magazine of History, and other history periodicals, Boomhower is the author of the books Jacob Piatt Dunn Jr., A Life in History and Politics, 1855 to 1924, The Country Contributor, The Life and Times of Juliet V. Strauss, Destination Indiana, Travels Through Hoosier History, But I Do Clamor, May Wright Sewall, A Life, 1844 to 1920, One Shot, The World War II Photography of John A. Buscemi, Gus Grissom, The Lost Astronaut, The Sword and the Pen, A Life of Lew Wallace, The Soldier's Friend, A Life of Ernie Pyle, Fighting for Equality, A Life of May Wright Sewall, Robert F. Kennedy and the 1968 Indiana primary, Fighter Pilot, The World War II Career of Alex Ryku, The People's Choice, Congressman Jim Jounce of Indiana, John Bartlow Martin, A Voice for the Underdog, Dispatches from the Pacific, The World War II Reporting of Robert L. Sherrod, Indiana Originals, Hoosier Heroes and Heroines, and Mr. President, A Life of Benjamin Harrison. His book, Richard Tregaskis, Reporting Under Fire from Guadalcanal to Vietnam, was published in November 2021 by the University of New Mexico Press. His latest book, Malcolm W. Brown, Tikwaunuk and the News Photograph That Stunned the World, was published in March 2024, also by the University of New Mexico Press. And now on to the show.
Hi, Rob. How are you?
Good. Thanks so much for your patience. I was doing some last-minute grocery shopping for my wife, and our oldest son had the same birthday on Friday. So I've been running around like crazy trying to get ready for that. So.
Well, they take priority, I'm afraid.
Absolutely. But thank you for coming back to the show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah. So I've been reading your book, your latest book, and I should say I did finish your Ernie Pyle book as well. So I guess that would make either 3 or 4 books of yours I've read now. So I'm kind of losing count. So I think before this is over, I'll probably have read all your books if you come back enough times. So.
Well, I'll keep coming back then if you're going to do that.
Excellent. So yeah, this is a really good book about Malcolm Brown, and it's definitely something that I've read about the Vietnam War a little bit, but I haven't really heard it from that perspective. I'm curious as to though what caused you to want to write a book about him specifically.
It grew directly out of the my last book project, which we talked about earlier, war correspondent Richard Tregaskis, who covered World War II for the International News Service. And after the war was over, he was a freelancer and went around the world reporting on stories for hire. And he decided that he really wanted to get back into combat. And in 1963, actually 1962 through 1963, to report on this new war going on between North and South Vietnam, were the young reporters who were sent by their news organizations to cover the war. And one of them was a young man named David Halberstam of the New York Times. And to Halberstam, Tregaskis was a hero of his. His dad was served in World War II, and I think he'd known about Tregaskis and his books and his work, including, of course, his most famous book, Guadalcanal Diary, which was a bestseller during the war. Anyway, Halberstam, kind of shepherded Tregaskis around with him, introducing him to some of his sources in the Mekong Delta region, which was an important part of the war in the early 1960s and later, of course, in South Vietnam. And after a long day in the field, they were going back to Saigon. And Tregaskis said to Halberstam, kind of out of the blue, if I was doing what you were doing, I'd be ashamed of myself. And what he was talking about was Halberstam raising doubts about, um, if the war was going as well as the officials in the American embassy were saying, and as well as the Kennedy administration officials were saying in Washington, D.C. And eventually, Tregaskis wrote a review of Halberstam's book about his time in Vietnam called The Making of a Quagmire, and kind of blasted it in a review for the Chicago Tribune. And at the end, he mentioned that there was a more kind of balanced view of the war, and it was from the head of the Associated Press Bureau in Saigon, named Malcolm Brown. Well, that's the first time I'd ever heard about Brown. And so Tregaskis's review and his mention of Brown intrigued me, and I got to think, well, I wonder what he's like. So I did a little research, and I found out that one of the most famous iconic images out of the Vietnam War was taken by Brown. And that was an image on June 11th, 1963, during a massive Buddhist protest against the Diem government in South Vietnam. And one of the monks, an elderly monk in his 70s, Thich Quan Nuc, paid the ultimate sacrifice and set himself on fire to bring attention to the Buddhist cause. And Brown was the only Western newsman there with a camera, and his photos went around the world and really brought the Vietnam War to the front pages for the first time. This is a great guy to write about.
Yeah, I'll say it's one of those things where, I mean, good photojournalism is so much about just being in the right place at the right time. Not to take anything away from it, of course.
No.
He took it a very good shot. But he just, like you said, he happened to just be there when no one else had a camera, and it kind of made me think of I don't who was the guy that shot the raising the flag on Iwo Jima.
Rosenthal, I
Yeah,
believe. Yeah,
yeah, I
the
remember reading a interview with him where he was just like, "Yeah, I was taking pictures over here, and I literally just turned my head, and oh, that's happening." Click, and it
yeah,
was like
yeah, just
bullets and
one click,
bullets
and
and
he's
click.
famous for all time. And
Absolutely.
one of the things that intrigued me also about that was the fact that Brown was not a photojournalist by
Hmm.
any means. He always took a camera with him, and while he was head of the AP bureau in Saigon, he made all his reporters take cameras with them because it really. Um, didn't have a lot of resources available. So, photographers were expected to take information that could be turned into news stories, and reporters were expected in the field to take pictures if they could. And so you have this guy taking an iconic image of the Vietnam War, and you're not even, a photojournalist. He's basically a reporter. He's more used to dealing with words than images.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that kind of old guard, I guess, of war reporters as opposed to this kind of these young bucks or whatever coming up in Vietnam, because that was one of the reasons I went back and read your Ernie Pyle book, is because you kind of mentioned him early on in the book. The School of Journalism at IU is of course named after him. He was a very famous World War II correspondent. However, he got pretty free reign, right? He got to go where he wanted to, and he was pretty friendly with everyone from, the average foot soldier all the way up to Eisenhower. Everyone
Exactly.
loved his work, and it was kind of like we're all on the same. He's telling the regular soldiers stories, and
Mhm.
he's operating in a much different environment than these Vietnam reporters are, because they're having to, like, you talk about this in the book, but they have like these paying people at the airport to bring stories home, and they're like tricking people to, like, put, at one point you talk about this incident where he had to put his story on the photo
wire when the sensor wasn't looking, and like
Right.
they're
Yeah, they used
constantly, yeah, exactly.
anything they could do to get the story out to the American public.
Yeah.
It was quite an adventurous time for a lot of the reporters in South Vietnam early on during the war.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just, like you said, they're kind of at odds because the Kennedy administration doesn't want to admit, that
Mhm.
there's any kind of dissent. And the DM government is falling apart, and we don't trust each other, and this is escalating out of control. Meanwhile, it's like, we're all kind of in one big push, so to speak, for World War II. It's just such a different circumstance to cover a war, I guess, between the
It
two.
is. Yeah, when you have the Kennedy administration wanting at all costs to keep the war off the front pages and not get the story out that, our advisors were supposed to be there just training the ARVN soldiers in the field. They were not supposed to be in actual combat, but as Brown found out early on when he was in Vietnam for the AP, he went out to the local airfield and saw, American pilots in the front seat of airplanes coming back, obviously having, shot their guns and dropped bombs. So that was not true. And the South Vietnamese government under Diem, they controlled their own media, and so they didn't understand why these Western newsmen were coming to their country and not supporting their efforts 100% because they were trying to fight communism. And they should be on their side. And but the reporters are going out in the field and finding out that maybe the war wasn't going as well as they were led to believe by the government officials from both the United States and Vietnam.
Yeah. Well, going back to that famous photo, it might be good to give some context in terms of what led to that, because I knew of that photo. Obviously, it's one of the most famous photos ever. And I remember I had a album by Rage Against the Machine when I was in high school that had
Right.
as the cover photo. So I was well familiar with it, but I didn't really understand the context, and I didn't really understand. Like, I thought maybe, okay, is this guy mad about the Vietnam War in general, or I didn't know what the circumstances was until I read your book. So maybe if you could give people a little background on the tension with the Buddhist community, especially in South Vietnam.
Well, you have the Buddhist community, who's probably the majority in South Vietnam as far as a religious organization, and you had the South Vietnamese government led by a Catholic, Diem, and there was this thought or belief by the Buddhists that they were being passed up for jobs in the government. Over, had to be Catholic, and some people even converted it to Catholicism to get important government jobs. And this tension kind of exploded in the spring of 1963 in Hue, where there was a religious celebration. The Buddhists were not allowed to fly their flags, while Catholic organizations were. Came to a head in a demonstration. Local police overreacted. A number of people were killed. And so soon, the Buddhists were demonstrating all over the country, but particularly in Saigon. And they were getting, a lot of attention from the Western reporters who covered their demonstrations. And they were trying to force the Vietnamese government into, giving them equal footing as far as government positions and being able to practice their religion freely. And eventually, they decided that they needed to do something major to get people's attention for their cause. And on the evening of June 10th, Brown received a phone call at his apartment over the AP office in Saigon from a Buddhist official who had given him solid tips before that there was going to be a demonstration the next day, and he should be sure to be there because he expected something very important would happen, but couldn't tell him what. Brown, believing that all the previous tips before had been good, and that the Buddhists were probably going to do something major, made sure to show up that next day for this demonstration. He set off early in the morning. He made sure to carry his camera with him. There were a few other reporters who also covered the demonstration, but he was the only one with the camera that day. And eventually, this large crowd of Buddhist monks and nuns, were marching down the street. There were about 350 monks, approximately in all, and they were led by this gray Austin sedan with some monks inside. And Brown was kind of confused because it's the first time that a demonstration had included an automobile. But they got to this major intersection, stopped, formed a circle around the intersection. The monks got out of the Austin sedan and helped this elderly monk, Juan Nick, to the center of the intersection. They put a pedal down for him. He kneeled down in the typical lotus position. They poured a can of what Brown later learned was kind of a modified gasoline over him. And he calmly, at about 9:22 a.m., struck a match and set himself on fire. And in a flash, that monk was sitting in the center of a column of flame which engulfed his entire body, said Brown. So um, he snapped away with his camera. He was numb at shock with what he witnessed and later described it as a kind of a horror. You can, it's always hard seeing anyone commit suicide or suffer a violent death. It's quite a hard experience, Brown said, but you can get used to it in war. But there was something special about this. This is something he'd never seen before. And what helped him was just doing his job, just doing the automatic things he needed to do, shooting several rolls of 35 millimeter black and white Tri-X film and trying to keep his mind off what he was seeing. He said to himself, the sun is bright and the subject is self-illuminated, so F16 at 125th of a second should be right. But he added, I couldn't close out the smell. And eventually, fire truck showed up, police showed up, but it was too late. The monks threw themselves in front of the wheels of the fire trucks to prevent them from doing anything. And the main thing on Brown's mind now was getting this film out of the country so that he could transmit it to the AP office and eventually to newspapers all across the world. So he had to get that raw film to AP's bureau in Manila in the Philippines. So he sent one of his colleagues, Van Tran, to the AP office with the film and arranged it for air shipment to Manila in the Philippines. And you were talking earlier about finding what they call these pigeons. That would be a passenger on a regular commercial flight from Saigon. They would convince to, carry this story or this film with them. And sometimes they paid them even. But they did find someone to do that and got the film. It was developed and transmitted via radio circuit to San Francisco, and from there to the AP's office in New York, for eventually publication by his clients, newspapers all over the country. And this was quite a shocking photo that appeared on a lot of front pages in newspapers all across the country. And President Kennedy, when he saw it, just had, a short, sharp exclamation. He said in a phone call to his brother Robert, and Jesus Christ, and couldn't believe what he was seeing.
Right. Well, when I was reading about the reaction to this photo, obviously, there's some other, famous photos that come to mind. One being the falling man from 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw a documentary about that by the same name. And in one section, they kind of talk about the newspapers that chose to reprint that photo and kind of the blowback they received. So what was the reaction in the general public when that photo went wide? Because obviously that was a shocking image to people that, definitely you have a visceral reaction just looking at it. So
yeah, and some papers decided not to use the photo. In fact, the New York Times went with a photo that Brown shot of some of the monks, throwing themselves under the wheels of the fire trucks. And a lot of newspapers, was competing at the same time with space on front pages of U.S. newspapers with news stories about an incident in Alabama where, Alabama Governor George Wallace was blocking the entry of two black students into the University of Alabama. So sometimes you see a front page newspaper, you have Brown's image tightly cropped of thick Quan Nook on fire. And then you have, George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door, refusing entry to these black students trying to get into the university.
Mm.
And really, it had a great impact. It really got people to think about the war, what was going on over there, why we were involved. There was a group of clergymen in the United States who used Brown's photograph for full-page advertisements in the New York Times and Washington Post, kind of decrying America's military aid to a country that would deny a lot of its citizens, basic religious freedoms. Communist officials in China used it and saying that, the monk's death was due to the work of U.S. imperialist aggressors and their DMS lackeys in the South Vietnamese government. And Henry Cabot Lodge, who later became ambassador from the United States to South Vietnam, said that no news picture in recent history had generated as much emotion around the world as that one had.
Mm.
And, there was a psychic um, debt paid by Brown for being there at the scene, taking the photograph. It weighed heavily, he didn't take any pleasure from the suffering he saw. Um, and sometimes journalists, influence events they cover. And although the effects are sometimes for the good, they can also be tragic, as in the case of the monk's death. And either way, when death is the outcome, psychic scars remained. And it remained for him for the rest of his life until his death in 2012.
Yeah. What do you think about the effects of an image like that going wide in the public? Obviously, this idea of self-immolation already existed, or it wouldn't have happened
Hmm.
in the first place. But we saw even just earlier this year, a man named Aaron Bushnell set himself on fire in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. Obviously, revolutionary suicide, as it's called, goes back many centuries, of course, and
Hmm.
Jonestown being a major example of that. But what about the effects of seeing this image in the world? And does the journalist take any responsibility for broadcasting that? And I also think of, the local San Francisco media I know has a self-imposed ban on covering, suicide jumpers off
Right.
the Golden Gate
Bay
Bridge,
Bridge.
because
Hmm.
there's a marked increase, of course, when they do, and they've measured that. So, what do you think about the knock-on effects, I guess, of an image like that going wide? I guess it's more a personal question for you. I don't know if Malcolm Brown ever expressed an opinion one way or another about that,
He
but
did, he was often asked, why he not interfered, tried to stop what was going on. But he pointed out that he probably couldn't have done anything to stop the self-immolation because, the 350 or so monks and nuns had clearly, rehearsed their roles for the ceremony many times and had already come up with methods for blocking any kind of interference from the crowd, as they showed when, they put their bodies in front of the wheels of the fire trucks when they showed up. But he, later said also that, trying to stop what happened had really not entered his mind. He said that he always felt that a newsman's duty is to observe and report the news and not try to change it. He thought it was his job as a journalist to take the pictures and get his story about the event and the photos to AP's wire service as quickly and efficiently as he could. And he thought it was difficult to conceive of any newsman acting otherwise. But as I said before, that didn't mean that it didn't weigh on his mind for the rest of his life. Um, he said one of the fringe benefits of being a journalist and seeing things like this and death in battle and something like this. And, he started out as a reporter for a newspaper in Middletown, New York. And he said he saw a lot of carnage, more carnage there, perhaps, and he'd even seen in Vietnam, covering car accidents,
Sure.
farmers' accidents, shootings, all the things that go wrong in society sometimes. Um, but it prepared him, for what was going to happen to him and going to happen to everyone. Eventually everyone dies, and he just had more experience than perhaps the rest of us have.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, being a former small town journalist myself, I can definitely say that there's a lot of mayhem that goes on in everything.
Right.
So, no doubt.
Yeah.
It's funny coincidence though that he worked at the same newspaper that I know from reading books about Hunter S. Thompson, that he
Hmm.
worked at that newspaper. That
Yep.
must have been quite a hub of young journalistic talent there. I mean, why was that such it seems kind of Middlebury, right? Middletown, where is that? Like, I don't even know.
Middletown, New York. Yeah. Well, it was a new newspaper, tabloid style. It was the first, I think, produced not by hot type, but by the offset printing method. I believe that's happened. And so they had hired a lot of young up and coming staff who didn't have a lot of experience, like Brown had really only his experience when he was a draftee in the U.S. Army and worked in the public information office in South Korea when he was serving his 2-year term of duty there after the war had ended and the armistice had been signed. But it was quite a staff, and they were expected to do a little bit of everything, cover everything from a county commissioners meeting to police run to an accident, to feature stories. Brown did one that I remember quite vividly, about a small town who outlawed shorts for men. They couldn't wear shorts during the summertime, so it was kind of an odd story. But all these young people came together, including Hunter Thompson, who didn't last too long. He
No,
wasn't
he
quite
did.
as
As I remember, he
professional.
destroyed a candy machine, I think was the official.
Yeah, it's a candy machine or a pop machine or something. I'm not quite sure. That didn't give him. He put his money in, didn't get what he wanted, and so he kicked it. But I think it's probably that in general
Yeah, I'm
insubordination
sure.
on his part.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I'm positive it
yeah.
wasn't just that.
No, a lot of other things probably came together for him to lose his
Oh
job.
yeah,
But
absolutely.
But it was a great experience for Brown. He learned a lot. He got his first taste of being a foreign correspondent. The paper sent him to Cuba
Hmm.
shortly after Castro had overthrown the Batista government. So he got some, foreign experience overseas.
Hmm.
Not long way away, but at least in a foreign country, and reported on this new revolution that was going on. It kind of whetted his appetite for further adventure, and he left Middletown to join the Associated Press, who sent him as their bureau chief in Saigon.
Hmm.
And it was quite a team eventually that gathered at the AP office, kind of small office, very tiny, tight space in Saigon. You had Malcolm Brown, who was head of the bureau. Eventually, you had a photographer, a German guy named Horst Faust, and then Peter Arnett, who's probably best known for his reporting from the first Gulf War for CNN. But he stayed in Vietnam for a long time, was there when Saigon fell in 1975. And all these guys, Brown, Arnett, and Horst Faust, eventually won Pulitzer Prizes for their reporting or their photography from Vietnam. So it was quite a talented bureau that was covering the war for the AP.
Hmm.
And, that's where a lot of people living in that country in the 1960s, you know, got their news about the war early on. Our early involvement when there were only, a few thousand American advisors in the country. Because, a small town newspaper in California or Florida or in the middle of the country is not going to usually send one of their reporters overseas. They just don't have the time or money to do so. So they had to depend on the wire services to take their reporting. And that's where people, tried to find out what was going on in Southeast Asia. And it was from, the AP, UPI, um, the men like that reported on the war.
Yeah. When I read that about this small town newspaper sending someone to Cuba, I thought of my last local journalism job where I got reprimanded by the publisher for asking for too many notebooks and pens. And it's a different time.
It was, yeah. Yeah, I remember my first job out of college in Rensselaer, Indiana, small town daily newspaper there, and I was thrilled when they let me go to Indianapolis to cover a debate for the U.S. Senate. I think it was between Richard Lugar and Birchby. They were running against each other, and
Right.
I got a little lost, but I did manage to get there and cover that debate.
Right.
But that was about it.
Right.
Indianapolis was about as far as I could go.
Definitely. Why is Malcolm Brown, despite the popularity and notoriety, I guess, of this photograph, why is he not better known? Because I know who David Halberstam is. He wrote the 50s, right? And
Right. Read a lot of
Peter,
best-selling books.
yeah, Peter
Best,
Arnett. I remember I watched the Gulf War when I was a kid.
yeah.
I remember him.
And a
So
lot of people were,
why do I not know Malcolm Brown?
yeah, a lot of people still remember Neil Sheehan because he wrote A Bright Shining Lie
Mm-hmm.
about John Paul Van, and it won a Pulitzer Prize as the bestseller. And he was there, reporting on the war with Brown and Halberstam and Arnett for the United Press International, UPI. And Brown, I think. The photo became more famous than he did. People, when they see that image, they consider it one of the iconic images of the war. But Brown kind of got lost in the shuffle, although he did win. He and Halberstam shared the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting in 1964. And a lot of people think that his photo of Juan Nook won the Pulitzer Prize, but it didn't that year because there was a lot of competition. The
Mm.
actual Pulitzer Prize went to a newspaper photographer from Dallas. I can't remember his name, but for his famous shot of capturing the moment when Jack Ruby, burst into the Dallas police
Oh wow.
headquarters and shot Lee Harvey Oswald, the expected assassin of
Busy
President
year
John Kennedy.
for the
Quite,
awards that
yeah,
year.
quite award, yeah. So, although Brown later went on to become a respected foreign correspondent for the New York Times, covering news stories everywhere from South America to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and eventually going back to Vietnam for the Times. He was there in 1975 with another Times reporter named Fox Butterfield, reporting on the collapse of the South Vietnamese government and the eventual loss of the country to North Vietnam. Um, and became also a famous science correspondent and columnist for the Times. He just never wrote that best-selling book that would kind of secure his place in history, and instead the photograph is remembered more than Brown is, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do the book is to kind of get people to know more about him and the contributions he made early on in the 1960s during America's involvement in Vietnam. He became kind of the dean of the Western newsmen and was quite a noted figure in Saigon among his fellow reporters and journalists, and was well respected and produced, I think, a great little handbook that he shared with any reporter who came new to the country
Hmm.
and came in. He called it a short guide to news coverage in Vietnam. It's like 24, 25 pages. It has some great pointers on who you could trust, what sources in the various embassies in Saigon, what kind of equipment you would need to get into the field, what kind of clothes you needed to have, and some pointers on surviving guerrilla warfare. He said, try to keep in good physical condition so you can march or run for a reasonable distance. You might have to save your life doing this at some point. You should know how to swim because canals and ditches often are above your head. If you hear a shot and think it's not from your own side, don't get up and look around to see where it came from because the second shot might get you, lying prone under fire and move only on your belly. Look for cover and move toward it. And he reminded them, that journalists aren't there to be heroes. When moving with troops, do not stay close to the head of a column or the point man in a formation. Professional soldiers are paid to do this. Do not stand or march next to a radio man or an aid man. They are prime targets. Stick instead close to the commander, who is generally in the safest position available. You'll learn more from him than most of the others anyway. And this is a great quote, I think, and it could be used by any newsman in any kind of situation where there's conflict and there's bullets flying around. The whole idea of covering an operation is to get the news and pictures back, not to play soldier yourself. And I think journalists who forget that sometimes pay for it in the end.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, we've only got a few minutes left, but what are you working on next?
Another war correspondent, this one a little closer to home. Malcolm Brown, was from New York City, and was born and raised there. I lived in Greenwich Village, was educated there. But I'm looking at another Vietnam War correspondent, a gentleman named Wallace Terry, who's probably best known today for producing the book Bloods, which was an oral history of African American soldiers in the war.
Mm.
Terry was a reporter for Time magazine in Vietnam. Before that, he covered the civil rights movement for the Washington Post and was raised here in Indianapolis.
Mm.
Went to Shortridge High School, was the first black editor of the Shortridge Daily Echo. Went to Brown University, was the first editor of an Ivy League newspaper, and made a name for himself covering the civil rights movement and eventually the war in Vietnam.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. Well, you're doing great work. Keep it up. I will keep reading. I've still got a long way to go. I know you're a prolific author, so I'm
I'll
working
keep
my way.
producing them, Rob. So if you keep reading them.
Great. But yeah, looking forward to reading more for sure. Thank you for coming back. It's always great to talk with you.
Anytime. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great to talk to you
Well,
as
I
well.
asked you last time what music you were listening to, and I believe you said Neil Young, which was a great answer.
Mhm.
What have you been listening to lately? What music?
I'm trying to think. I made a playlist recently and some female artists were on it. I've discovered, although I think I'm the last person to discover this group called Wet Leg.
No, I don't know that one.
It's a band out of I think they're from England. I'm not sure.
Hmm.
Anyway, they're very poppy, very rock oriented, and I've enjoyed some of their music recently.
Cool.
And as always, I've also been enjoying REM. I can always
Hmm.
turn to their music for solace whenever the times are dark, which I do
Yeah.
often. Yeah.
Well, you you put yourself in some pretty dark places, so I think
Yeah.
you need to bring yourself up somehow.
Yeah. It's always good to like listen to music of the time period when you're writing
Yeah,
about a particular
absolutely.
person. I try to do that from time to time. Yeah.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, no, I always thought that historical books, especially a good playlist would go a
Mhm.
long way if you
Yeah.
could coordinate that somehow.
Mhm. Yeah.
But yeah, that's great. Well, thank you for coming back. I hope to talk to you again soon. And yeah, I'll be making my way through your many, many books, and everyone else should as well. So
I appreciate that, Rob. Thank you, and happy reading.
thank you. All right. Have a good night.
Thanks, Rob.
Bye.
Bye.